Standing up in McKinney, this is, according to Callus, episode 633, coming to you on the 7th of May, the year of our Lord 2024. That's right, 3 days after the Sith holiday and 2 days after Cinco de Mayo. All right, before we get into the show, I'm going to entitle it A City for the People. Let me remind you the best way that you can help me continue to make a difference, get our voice out there, strike a blow to the constant drone of what everybody else is saying, an ode to independent thought in media, perhaps, but maybe I go too far. In either case, you help me get my voice out, and quite frankly, my voice is probably a whole lot closer to your voice than anything else in the media. And just in case you didn't know, you can follow me on Facebook, Gab and MeWe. I'm a pro at Gab, and I've got a page and a group over at Facebook. Still up, as of the last time I looked, at YouTube. Go to your favorite podcatcher of choice. I'm hosted at Podbean. I'm on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, and the Google Store. So come and join us. Continue to make a difference by liking, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff. Here we go on with the program. I want to make a special note. There was an election on the 4th, the municipal elections. In McKinney, 4 of the 5 bonds passed, and one of the 4 that passed was by an itty-bitty percentage. I think less than 70 votes. So for those of you that say it doesn't matter, or why should I vote, there's your answer right there. Secondary to that, right, down in Allen, they had 3 city council members up, or races up, I should say. 2 of them were incumbents. They went to a runoff yet again. And the third guy, the third Dave 3, David Scott, was not successful in at least getting a runoff. Hey, he gave it his best, and he came, percentage-wise in at a good amount. I mean, all is not lost. Do not panic. We'll double down. We've got the runoff. And Dave 1 and Dave 2 are in a good spot, just where they were 3 years ago. Now, I want to take a moment here, in addition to that, before I get into the main topic, and just say that what we're watching here is the establishment pushing back. The revenge of the empire, if you will, right? Or the empire striking back. No, look, seriously, when you have your establishment Republicans partnering up with the Democrats to win, that tells you all you need to know. Now, that being said, it has been my experience there's a whole lot of normal Democrats out there that largely are quiet. They're quieted by the crazy lefties that are also Democrats. And I suspect part of the reason why the establishment Republicans sell out the conservative Republicans all the time, aside from being part of the Uniparty, is that they're embarrassed. They don't want to be on the same team with the conservatives or the religious people. They want to just have their good business and, exploit the people around them. I mean, it's terrible to put it that way, but at a certain point, we have to come to grips with the fact that that's the way it looks. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. It just looks that way. In the constant sellout, the constant disappointment by people that you think are on your team it's depressing. But I think largely this stuff is motivated by money. I think everything to a degree is motivated by money, and money sets aside principle for a whole lot of people. I'm not one of them. I'd like to believe most of my listeners are not either, but it does happen, especially in politics. That's just something we have to deal with. We have to figure it out, and we have to find a way to overcome it. And I got to be honest, if you run a nice, clean campaign and you stay positive and you're there and you meet people and you keep your, let's call them somewhat aggressive supporters under control, I think you're going to do a whole lot better than what you would otherwise. Of course, that's just my opinion. And what do I know? I couldn't win a race either. Oh, but I've called a lot of them. Okay, here we go. On with the program. My 5 minutes worth of intro is over. A city for the people. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, one, because as we see, there are a lot of different visions or different ideas for what a city should have, what it should provide, how it should grow. And we watch this play out to some extent with the Big Four right here in Collin County. Now, Plano, and let me be clear, I've been in Texas for roughly 27 years. I've lived here longer than anywhere else in my life. I am a converted Texan, right? I'm a Texian. I'm not going anywhere. I found my paradise and I'm here and I'm going to defend it. So when I first moved here, Plano was it. Plano was the place to be. 1997. Now, Plano has a lot of things going for it, but it was planned out logically. It was planned out, kind of a modified grid pattern, and they were going to have their interspersing retail areas. They were going to provide for their neighborhoods as they built out. It was designed that way. Now, it didn't necessarily come to full fruition that way, and there have been intervening market actions or downturns, if you will, that have interfered with some of that build out. There's always been the latest craze to come down the pike, right? Of the latest thing that needs to be done. The live, work, play thing is the current one. Before that, it was malls. Before that, the subdivision, right? I don't know that there is a perfect alignment or design for everywhere. Or let me rephrase that. I don't think you can use the same design everywhere. It may be a perfect design in, say, like Chicago, but it doesn't necessarily work in New Orleans. And what works in New Orleans doesn't necessarily work in Dallas. And then, of course, there's Houston. and I watch videos on YouTube that talk about cities and layouts and, urban sprawl and that kind of thing. And I do it for educational purposes. My wife still lovingly refers to my time when I get home at night as professor hour. But I do that because, one, I like to wrap my head around how different things are built up and how they're developed. And what of it is organic and what of it is planned and how does that work out? So one of the things that I've noticed is there are a group of people that seem to think that not only they know what's best for you, mentally, spiritually, but also economically and, quite frankly, how you should raise your family and live in your normal life. Now, this group of people overlaps and morphs and changes over time. Some would loosely identify them as progressives. I think that's fair. But one of the things that I took away from it is, like many other negative things, this is a movement as far as city design that kind of drifts out of Germany. Say what you want. But the Germans are very strong believers in order, right? Everything should have its place and everything should have its function, which is a little bit different than, say, the English view of things or the Irish or, other Europeans' views of how things work. We won't even get into the other parts of the world and how they sort this stuff out, because when the United States, or these United States more appropriately, were divvied up and built out, it was primarily of people of European heritage. And they came here and they wanted to adapt what they thought was best about, the old world into the new world. So while I'm not a huge fan of progressivism, that would be an understatement, and while I rail against socialism and unionism and all that other stuff, I can see some benefits to order, to grid patterns, to the way things were designed and visualized. And to a degree, that is helpful. But then you run across a place like Houston. And I know I've touched on this a little bit in the past, and bear with me here because this is a slightly different outcome we're going to go for today. Houston is often criticized because they don't have enough coding. They don't divvy up their zoning enough. It's as if the city of Houston said, well, yeah, that's well and good, but we're not going to force people to do certain things. Within reason, they're going to pretty much be able to do what they want. They're going to design the facade how they want. We're going to give them liberty, freedom. Such a strange concept, right? I mean, who would have thought that, a state within these United States might have a city or a county that looked upon the idea and transferred it to the people at the local level. So these same modern architects of proper city living look down with disdain on Houston. And they keep coming up with different ways to evaluate and order the lives of people that live in cities. Now, I'm going to be the first guy to tell you, some of it looks really good. In fact, it's impressive when it's on paper. But life isn't that way. Life is not completely orderly. There are some assumptions. There's some things that are common. But if you try and force people to conform 24/7, sooner or later, it breaks down. Especially when you inject large sums of people, or large quantities of people, would probably be the more accurate way to phrase that is when demographics change and different cultures come in, they have different expectations of what's appropriate. And without judging or putting down another culture or a specific culture that's not European American, let's just say that if you allow for the natural growth and maturity of that culture to be reflected in the city, the neighborhood that they live in, it creates some interesting things about it. So if you're trying to design a city and you do it from the top down and you critically line in everything everywhere and how it must be and nothing can deviate, you get a very sterile, very repetitive city look. Now, I've referenced this before. I grew up in a town called West Allis. That's in Wisconsin. And say what you want, but it was a blue-collar town, lower to upper middle class, if you will. Nothing, super anything there. However, I distinctly remember and have fond memories of the old downtown Main Street. I have distinct memories and a fondness for, we would call them apartment blocks. What they were was groups of apartment buildings, usually 8, sometimes 12 units per building, and you'd have maybe 4 or 5 of them in a row. They would call them mid-rise buildings, if I remember correctly. Then you would have the duplex, which is 2 families would live in a single house. The first floor would be one family, and the second floor would be another family. They also had something called a Polish flat, which would be the basement was leveled up to where a family lived in the basement, and then the raised first floor would have another family. Now, this allowed for a certain amount of density, but it also allowed for independence, creativity. The other thing that went along with this were storefronts. You were not prohibited from running a business from your home property. Whether it was a shoe cobbler or a small bakery or a little dime store, 5 and dime store, or a craft store or whatever else, you would have those storefronts on the city streets. And on some of the bigger corners, you'd have that building and you'd have a business on the first floor and 6 or 8 apartments upstairs, depending on the layout and how big the apartments were. And that was, to me, that is how I visualize my city from my childhood. And you had some other bigger stores that were on the main street. You had some other outlying areas that had some other big stores that were like similar to Main Street, but not Main Street. There was a culture, and it was a built-in. And the other thing, for better or for worse, there were the local watering holes, right? On the street I grew up on, or off of, I didn't grow up on it, but there was the main street. there was an enormous amount of small pubs, saloons, taverns, whatever else. Again, blue collar town, people would leave the major employer and they would walk their 6 or 8 blocks home, or maybe they lived a mile away, but they would still walk home by and large because they all live close to work. And they, depending on what shift they got off, they might go stop at what is essentially a friend's house, have a beverage or two, maybe eat a little something, and then go home. Whether they go home and go to bed, or go home and spend time with the wife and the family, or go play softball, or whatever the situation was, they were there. Now, when I think about this, and I hear people talking about walkable towns, the 15-minute city, those sound positive. They sound like a nice thing. It's reminiscent of my childhood. But then when I realize that that's not actually what they're going for. This is more top-down urban planning, keep people isolated in areas and under control and not allowing them to move freely. See, every street had homes with garages in the back, cars parked on the street, and everybody had a car in the family. Maybe not 2 or 3 like is common these days, but they had a car. Now, maybe mom stayed at home, or maybe she worked somewhere close by. Maybe she helped out in the school. You know, there were tons of other things. Or maybe she just watched the neighbor's kids while the neighbors went to work. Now, if you live a half a mile or a mile from work, unless it's the dead of winter in Wisconsin, you can walk there without too much trouble. Now, how convenient it is, whether or not that's something you want to do, because of the amount of time it takes, that's a different story. Or you can get into town and drive, or get into a car and drive to town, downtown Milwaukee, if you will, or maybe you'd go out to one of the further outlying cities that was a city but not Milwaukee, and you'd work there in whatever factory or office building there, right? It grew out more organically, in my opinion. Now, I know some of it was planned, some of it was plotted out, and it grew in sections. But one of the things that I noticed is there were parts of my town that there were homes that were over 100 years old. But right next to them were homes that were probably built, I don't know, kid of the 80s, let's say 30 years earlier. I always thought that was neat. I thought it added 2 things, because clearly this block or these couple of blocks were developed in a certain time period based upon the preponderance of the homes there. But it's not like they filled up that entire block and moved on to the next one. They left lots behind. The other thing that happened, and I know this for a fact, is some of those homes were able to buy 2 lots, and they would have a double lot. They'd have a home on one side and the other side would be open, whether it would be used for future development or just a big yard for the kids to play in or whatever. And that, I wouldn't say it was common. I'd say probably maybe 1 or 2 per block. And when you've got, let's say, 20 homes on a city block, maybe 24, that's not a lot. 1 in 20, maybe. But it added some interesting character and stuff. And of course, we had alleys because we were in the city. But it was anything but a sterile, boring environment, right? So I distinctly remember as a kid, you walked to school. You didn't have your mommy or her friend down the street give you a ride to school. No. And to be honest, I crossed multiple major streets when I was in grade school. And guess what? I survived. Now, granted, that same thing couldn't really be easily duplicated now because, quite frankly, there's not a lot of sidewalks that are in linear lines to where you can see 2 or 3 blocks down and easily, navigate obstacles, right? We've built out our curvy subdivision roads, and there's tons of blind spots, and everything is designed for flow of cars to the freeway. Not that I have a major problem with that, but it altered the design and the layout of a city street. And even if you live in the suburbs, which is trying to mimic many of the accoutrements of the city, you have to consider, if you put a whole bunch of dead ends in here and there's no through streets, it doesn't offer for a lot of options to get places. I remember that I had probably 3 or 4 paths that I would routinely take when I would walk to middle school. And by taking a different path, you kind of learn where things are at. You're not running down the same road every day. It kind of makes you a little less likely to run into issues. Draw your own conclusions what that might be involved with. But we took that away. In many instances, apart from an occasional path that goes through the local towns here in McKinney, Allen, or Frisco, or Plano, there's really 1 or 2 major routes that you can get anywhere to. Now, it's aesthetically pleasing when you're on the road, I guess. But that's the other thing I recall. A great number of roads had trees, large trees, out on them, past the sidewalk or between the sidewalk and the road. And they cast a giant shadow over large sections of the road. And when you were outside, you weren't getting beaten down by the oppressive sun. And there were all these things that were readily available. Now, keep in mind, I did not live in Milwaukee, the city proper, but I lived in a very close, we'll call it an inner belt subdivision. Or inner belt suburb, not subdivision, suburb. And there was nothing special, nothing unique. There certainly weren't, $500,000 homes up and down each side of the road. And of course, back in the 80s, $500,000 was a whole lot of money. Not so much anymore. But the thing is, looking back now, north of 50, and I think back 40 years at how cool my childhood was, how interesting my city was, all the unique things in the little town that I grew up in. And I reflect at the things that got lost as we, moved up or aged up, if you will, in the cities. And then I look at where I live now. McKinney's got an awesome downtown area. Some of it's been redeveloped very well. Some of it less so. Some of it's slated to be flattened and redone. And if it matches the aesthetic, I would buy it. I would think that sounds good. And certainly some of the buildings not having been attended to for an extended period of time don't lend themselves to being repaired for a reasonable amount of money. I'm sure the same things could be said about Allen. They have a unique district over on the east side there that they're trying to build out at some point in the future. My understanding is a lot of it was destroyed by a fire years ago, because I always wondered, why are there all these vacant lots just east of 75, just north of Main Street in Allen? It would seem to me that would be prime location that you put a business in, or some of those mid-rise apartment blocks, or something to where people are there and they want to be there. I'm not sure I'd go all the way in with this live, work, play nonsense. And I shouldn't call it nonsense, because legitimately that stuff is really neat. There's one down in off of Bethany, just west of 75. Of course, both the legacy developments are based on that concept. There's another one going in called The Farm, or Hub 121. These are all really neat in the sense that there are a lot of, we'll call them semi-urban professionals that want to live there. Say they're under the age of 35, they have no kids, they want that environment. I think that's great. But that does not build a city. That is not a long-term prospect. A town or a city is built out of the idea that you have families move in, they raise their children there. Some of the children are going to leave, but some stay. Maybe they move in and take over the house when their parents go to retirement. Maybe they move in, a half a block, half a mile, or 10 miles away. Hello, Raymond. There are so many different ways this plays out. But you want your city or your town to be exciting enough that people want to come there. But you also want to make it home, right? You want to encourage people to stay, to see a value to putting multiple generations there. I remember when I was, again, a kid, and I would travel out. We knew a family that for quite some time they would buy a house, they'd fix it up. They were flippers without being called flippers back then, but they would live in the house, and then it may take them 3, 4, 5 years to do everything they want to do to it, and they'd sell it, make a profit, and move on to the next one. Well, what's funny is I ran into that family again later on, prior to graduating high school, and we had separated. It had been probably 10 years, and I hadn't seen anybody in their family, but they had purchased what was left of a farm, I guess, not far from the freeway, out west of where I lived. And they still had some acreage, and I think they may have been technically farming a section of it, but they had the old barn house, or the old farmhouse, I should say. They had an old barn, and a lot of stuff was converted. And clearly, this has always been kind of humorous to me. As a child of the 80s, but I still remember the 70s, because I was young in the 70s, but I remember a lot of it. And I always tell people, I went through the 70s once, I don't want to repeat it. So when the 90s came and the 2010s came, and I'll take a pass on it. But I do remember a lot of, let's call it the deco, if you will, within the converted barn space was clearly 70s stuff. And I always thought that was humorous. I mean, it was kind of cool because it was dated now, but it had an aesthetic to it. It was interesting. So even on the outskirts of this town I grew up on, and you'd have to go probably, 10 miles away, and you find this. So it's this quasi-rural thing. Now, sadly, when I go home to Wisconsin, and it's always going to be home because that's where I was born and raised. But when I go home, I see these areas that were formerly rural. Even if you'd call them ex-urban, they're now just a plot of subdivisions. And rather than having the city-like feel where there's something unique, something, permanent about it, it's just comes across like a sterile environment that mom, dad, and two kids are there for, enough time for little Johnny or little Mary to go to school, and then they move on to the next thing. Now, I got to be honest, that's kind of what I was going for when I was 30. When I was 25, that was kind of the ideal. I want to live in the suburbs. I want to do this. I want to do that. And honestly, in my opinion, McKinney has a good balance of the city and the suburb. And, we ended up in McKinney as more like a happenstance. But as time's gone by, I feel better and better about the decision, not only to come here, but to stay here. I mean, there are things about Allen that, especially now in the last 10 years, that have put it in a position where it's got some really neat things and some exciting things going on there. But I don't know that I would want to uproot there. And as nice as Plano was back in the day, McKinney now has all of that. Plus, we have that really nice downtown aesthetic, the old city feel to it, if you will. Now, as far as the multifamily homes, look, I'm an advocate for duplexes. I'm an advocate for, the 12 to 24 unit apartments on a block. I think those are good mid-level things. I just don't know that they're doable in today's day and age. But I absolutely fail to see the value add. There is a value. It's just I don't know if it's an add to the city for having, let's call them 1,500 units dropped into a certain location. And maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's not fair. It might only be 300 units. But I still fail to see the advantage. I put in 10 buildings. They all have 25 or 30 units in them, depending on how high they are. And yes, now we've got all these people that are going to move in there. But it seems to get lost on the people that when you do that, it changes everything around it. Is it a net positive? Yeah, there's more people. Yeah, it's growth. But is it good, solid, positive growth? I mean, when you talk to the police, when they're, the people that are actually in the field, if you will, they'll freely admit, oh yeah, there's more crime there because there's more people there. And that doesn't even get into who lives there, just that there are a bunch of people living there. And that shouldn't be a surprise because when you put a bunch of people in a dense situation, they run into trouble because there's a lot of people there. It's not that they're worse people or they're lesser people or anything like that. It's just there's a lot of people. And it only takes one to create a problem. Wow, I went really long here. So, but again, let's circle back to that idea. You want to keep your town or your city attractive to where the next generation wants to stay, where there's something there that ties the people to it. There's something that is both attainable and desirable about the town or the city that you live in. Now, that may work with an attraction. Certainly parks work. Parks and open spaces are huge draws, especially if they're well maintained and they're there long term. People have very positive memories of that. I can fondly remember about 3 or 4 parks that I would walk to as a boy, a young person, and I would spend an afternoon or all day there depending on what was going on, and I had a great time. And when I go home to Wisconsin, I see them, I'm like, oh, I have so many great memories with this. This is really a nice thing. Some of that's been replaced in the 27 years that I've been in Texas. There are a couple of nice parks in McKinney or even Allen. Been to a couple, I think, in Frisco as well. It's not the same because when you're older, you're taking your kids and you're hoping that your kids get something out of it and that they desire it and they want to come back to it. It's an attachment. I don't know that you get the same out of, we have an amusement park, but if you have an actual nature park there, that's something that stays. It's both obtainable, meaning not a lot of money, and retainable, meaning that you don't have to be dependent on that business staying open. Now, how and why does this work? Again, there's a balancing act here, right? People are always wanting to organize things from the top down. I don't know if that's the Germanic thing or not, but they always feel like they know what's best. They want to tell you what you should be doing, what you can be doing, and this is how you should do it. What I'm suggesting is we need to ease up a little bit on that. We'll need to allow for some different things. Yeah, I understand that there's some people that live in certain neighborhoods that would pitch a fit if somebody wanted to have a home-based business or if they wanted to open up a little small bakery in the front of their house. But guess what? Maybe the majority of them would really like that. I mean, I don't know. I don't live on Wattle Street, but I'm pretty sure in Wattle Street, they don't necessarily want that. But maybe on Church Street, they might be open to it, particularly if you're a block or two off of Virginia or Louisiana, which serve as Main Street, if you will, for our downtown where the square is. Maybe they'd be open to having that little cobbler shop. And I don't even know that you're going to have a cobbler anymore. But go with me here. A small home-based business. Somebody lives there and they can take care of their local customers. You could return back to an idea that, hey, I live 2 or 3 blocks off the square. And if I walk down to the square, I can get groceries. Well, there's not a grocery store right now. Well, I can go to a nice restaurant. Well, there's a couple of restaurants there. I can go buy some clothes. Well, yeah, unless you want to spend a lot of money in a boutique. I mean, we need to find a way that we can incentivize people that would be willing to do something like that. I don't know how that works, especially when we're giving bank to big corporations to come in and do things. That doesn't build your culture necessarily, certainly doesn't build your community, but that's what is in. That is what everybody wants. Because it creates jobs or it looks good or it's something I can put on my resume when I'm running for a higher office. That's fine. But at the end of the day, if you want to have a city that's for the people, you have to actually listen to the people. If the people don't have a buy-in, they're not going to want to stick around. And I guess really that's the biggest shortcoming, if you will, for large sections of the city I live in McKinney. There are a whole lot of people that are here transient. They came here because of a job or because they were relocated temporarily. They have no regard for what happens 5 or 10 years from now because they don't plan on being here. They may have their kids in their high school long enough that they can get their football games in or get a scholarship to go off to college, and then the parents are moving on. And whether it's with Toyota or State Farm or whatever large corporation moves in next, that's great. And it gives us that growth and that spark that we need, but that doesn't continue to build our culture. It doesn't protect and expand our community long term. Just like we have the people that want to drive things from top down, we shouldn't be compromising and changing everything to accommodate some people that are going to only be here for 4 or 5 years. We want to build an aesthetic that keeps the community here, that encourages the community to stay and bring the next generation along with them. Now, how does that happen? How does that play out? Yeah, I don't really know. I don't know that there is a good answer. But I tell you what would work, or what is an option. Let's let Allen be Allen. Let's McKinney be McKinney. Let's let Frisco do Frisco. And let's watch and see what happens next for Plano. We shouldn't be looking to mimic and be exact copies of the town right next to us. We should look for distinctive things that we can offer, things that are unique to the city that we live in. Our tagline for McKinney is unique by nature, and there's a lot of groaning, and I guess to a degree, rightfully so, that there's too much concrete. But that's a natural consequence of growth. That's a natural consequence of the migration that we're all living under right now. Could we do things better? Yes. Should we give some more thought to how certain things happen? Absolutely. But I don't believe that good, solid, community building culture can grow and be established in a top-down controlled environment. I just don't. If we wanted to mimic and follow a bunch of small town German things, Prussia, which doesn't exist anymore, but go with me here. They're well laid out towns. They're well organized, and they're very prompt. But we in the Americans, we in these United States, we just don't go that way. And as Texans, we like to be independent. We like to do our own things. We like to be heard and observed. We like to interact. We like to linger. We need to keep those things in mind when we're laying out designs and plats for the continued growth of our city. Now, I'm very hopeful and I'm very grateful that some of those people are starting to look at how can we do things long term? How can we make a difference? I think some of those basic things are already here and will continue to be built upon. But rather than using genetic fallacy to go after ideas, i.e., I don't like this idea because this person is the one that's supporting it or promoting it, let's look at things at face value. Let's be honest. Is a net positive going to come out of this? Is this something that is going to be unique or encouraging about our city, our town? Is this something that's going to build our culture and build our community? And if it is, great, then let's get behind it. Even if it's not maybe something that you're specifically excited about, can you at least objectively look at it and say, yes, that is a net positive? Set aside your preference for the larger principle, building the community, helping the culture of which we live in. Now, look, not everybody's going to be happy all the time. I know that. I mean, look, I'm disappointed quite often. But if you can't look at things with the attitude that things are not bad, they could be better. How do we make them better? Oh, yeah, I'll just keep working on these things, and it'll get slightly better. And slightly better is better than getting worse. But to do nothing, to allow entropy, to allow the progressives come in and dictate and mandate things from the top down is not going to be a positive outcome for us long term. So I'm asking you, please stay involved. Stand up, let your voices be heard. We cannot be represented if we're not representing ourselves. We're not going to make an attractive city and continue to build upon what great things we already have is if we're not going to take the time to invest in this. And with that, we've been extremely long. This has been According to Callus, and I will see you on the other side.